Thank you for inviting me to this hearing. I'm coming at this from a somewhat different angle than probably all the other speakers in my role as the broadband coordinator and also previous roles at USDA. But before I start, I think it's important to set very briefly the global and national context we are in, because if you have to understand that then to figure out how we better should deal with the drought and the other issues. If you look globally for and this affects California agriculture, there are four basic global drivers taking us to 2050. One's global population increase, one is rapid urbanization. Half the world now lives in cities. There's a growing middle class around the world, and there's a climate change impact that's going on. There are four long-term trends in response to this: rising food prices, rising global trade of food, rising demand for protein, fruits, and vegetables, which is exactly what California produces, and we see agriculture adapting to climate change, which is, you read drought into this as a factor of that. Nationally, California is the top agriculture producing and exporting state. California ag production in 2013 was 46.4 billion, far greater than number two, which is Iowa at 31.2 billion, more than twice that of Texas at 21.6. I just toss that in because we hear about Texas all the time. And California ag exports were a record 21.2, when you heard that earlier, billion in 2013. California agriculture, like its population, is notable for its diversity. It makes it distinctive from the rest of the country, with 400 different crops grown. An estimated 1/2 of U.S. fruits and vegetables are grown in California. 2/3 of the world's almonds are produced in California. This success, and it's a long-term success, is due to a mixture of the Mediterranean climate that we have, plus innovation, risk-taking, and adoption by California farmers. California agriculture is simultaneously both local, farm to fork, and feeds the state, nation, and world. So you have this combination. But the drought comes in as a major disruptive event. The fifth year of a drought could be longer, has disrupted the status quo, and for purposes here, has disrupted the status quo in agriculture's water supply. 100% of the state is in drought. Exceptional drought and extreme drought cover the entire Central Valley, which produces 75% of California's ag production. Another way to look at it is we are the drought equivalent of, if you are a Garrison Keillor fan, when he talks about Lake Wobegon, where all children are above average, all of California is above average in drought in terms of status. That's not the greatest thing to have. I think you've already heard some details about the numbers and the drought impact before. I would say the two figures to be of concern about is the increase in fallow land from the 400,000 acres to over 500,000 acres, or up 32%. And the discussion about job losses, the estimate of 17,000 in 2014 and rising 9% to 18,000 in 2015. But there's a greater drought impact beyond the amount of fallow land and number of lost farm worker jobs. You heard that in the previous panel. And I'd kind of like to rephrase that as well, because I was at a roundtable in October, a farm worker roundtable on drought in the San Joaquin Valley. And again, in that meeting, there was direct individual description of the impact of the drought. They put a human face on the drought beyond the macro numbers that I typically would look at. But I'll just summarize what they said and what you also heard before. That there is a disruption of the farm labor market. It's not just unemployment of farm workers because of changes in the types of crops grown and the resultant change in the number of farm workers needed for those type of crops. It's actually quite disruptive of the status quo. And there are changes in the nature of farm work, which I'll get into more in a second. In some cases, a lot less farm workers are needed per acre, so that's part of the disruption of those who are already working. And you know, part of the disruption in the local rural communities is that these farm jobs that do exist, they're much further away. So people in that roundtable, they were talking about traveling as much as 50 miles to those jobs. And that's a big change in terms of cost to them, in terms of gasoline and having to have a car to get to those distances. And farm workers are very explicit in their view of the drought and drought assistance. And you also heard part of that in the previous panel, but I'd like to reiterate it. It was quite explicit, the discussion about leveraging current drought assistance to enable farm workers in the rural community to be better off after the drought ends. They're not interested in stopgap measures that would just get you through that time period and then you're not any better off after the drought. Because you also have to remember that in California, and particularly in the Central Valley, the highest level of poverty in the state is in these rural communities. And that poverty level was there before the drought, before the recession. It's there, and the farm workers are asking for means of dealing with that. It's one of the things. And what I thought was interesting, and this is particularly my role as the broadband coordinator, is that farm workers expressed a need for broadband access in rural communities. They was a direct reason for that because they recognize that broadband is a means to access worker training, which you also heard about in the previous panel, to worker training to get the skills for the new drought-adjusted agriculture. And if you look at it, that's their perspective that they raised. I'll look at the same thing from my perspective as an economist, or an agricultural economist. And the drought is a disruptive event, but there can be a positive side that comes out of it if you think about it. It does, as a disruptive event and essentially knocking out the status quo in a lot of things going on in agriculture, what it does do is opens the door for innovation and stimulates innovation. Basically, it forces people to innovate if they're going to survive. And it opens the door, and if you think about innovation, innovation is a key part of what California agriculture has a whole history of being known for. It's why we got to where we are in California agriculture. It's also the tech industry. And we are now seeing the two come together. And the opportunity with innovation, somewhat stimulated by the drought, but it was happening anyway, moving faster. So if the drought is driving farmers to adopt the latest new silicon chip-based technology, and it's a fast fundamental shift that's occurring. I think it's comparable to the advent of mechanization in the early 20th century and the steel plow in the mid-19th century. It's coming very fast. The drought's moving it faster than it otherwise might. This technology change is driven by the need to use available water for farming more efficiently or more effectively. It offers the opportunity for farming not just to survive the drought, but actually to thrive in whatever new water ethos there is. The net consequence for farm workers is this. It's going to change the nature of the skills needed for farming. And I think the farm workers, even in the previous panel, but certainly at that round table, they seem to recognize that. And what it means is that a new set of skills needs to be obtained to be able to do that kind of more technology-oriented farming. Farm workers' education can be met by using existing programs in distance learning through the community colleges, existing workforce training programs, particularly the community colleges in rural areas such as West Hills, Coalinga, or Reedley are at the forefront of this. West Hills, who I have actually worked with quite a bit, they have their Farm of the Future program, which is the hands-on training of the newest of whatever farming technology or farming skills that are needed. They're doing that directly there. This new ag technology, it's not just water-oriented, but it does cover a lot of different areas, from water to increased yield. You've heard references to that. Shrinking the environmental footprint of agriculture, energy usage, either shrinking energy usage or renewable energy, and then another area in food safety. And there was kind of a half reference to that, the discussion about pesticides, which comes in with that. What these technologies have in common is the use of silicon chip technology and remote sensing and control devices to generate and transmit data. The resultant data analytics combined with agronomics offers much greater efficiency in the use of water and increases in yield. Agriculture data analytics also offer the ability to run scenarios into the future of alternative types of crops that could be grown, given the inputs that are there, what you think the inputs would be, say less water in the future, and figure out which of the 400 crops that are produced in California might be better off to be grown. Again, farm workers will need to acquire these new technology-based skills in the shift to this technology-oriented agriculture. And I think it's important to remember that this technology does not replace farmers or farm workers. It is a new tool for better farming with or without drought. This ag technology has a major constraint, and it's not water. It depends on transmission of data from sensors in the farm field. This would be the shorthand description of it. Wireless broadband access in the farm field has to be available to utilize this technology. And this is the weak point of California's rural infrastructure, rural broadband. Broadband overall is a platform for rural prosperity. For today's discussion, we're just talking about ag technology in the farm field, but there's a whole other range of things. And in fact, today, as we're here at UC Davis, there is an Apps for Agriculture hackathon going on where they're actually developing apps with direct application to agriculture. And it occurred to me, because I was there yesterday when they started the hackathon, and one of the discussions that was raised by one of the farmers there of an app they were looking for was an app that would reach farm workers and give them education or the knowledge of the pesticide rules in their native language. And this would be an application of, you could think of it this way, of social media into creating an app that would give you all the lessons of what you need to do in the native language, and also it would be, I guess it would be audio. So it's not dependent on a written set of instructions, which may or may not work for depending upon that population. So this is the kind of innovation that can come from technology if you push it. But again, it doesn't work unless you've got the rural broadband. It's also a link between both the rural and the urban parts of California. In the handout, in these charts, there's like a big, I won't go through it, but there's a big sort of charts which shows that linkage between the urban and rural parts of California. I mean, notably, I guess one piece of that would be on telehealth, telemedicine, linking urban hospitals and healthcare to the rural patient or farm worker. It's a much more seamless application of things, but the whole range of areas is part of that. And, you know, one of the things that's important to remember about broadband is when you think of California, when they talk about broadband, and they talk about the 96% of the state that's urban in terms of where the population is, but you have to remember 95% of the state by geography is rural. You don't get a statewide ubiquitous broadband system unless you fill in the 95% of the state. And that's something that if you talk to the telecommunications people, they don't think about, because they're very focused on the urban population and where that is. So in that sense, we are today literally in a very similar situation to what we were in the 1930s with electricity. In the 1930s, electricity had come to all the big cities. Rural America was not wired up. And it didn't pencil out for the electric companies. So you can understand why that is. And that's where, at USDA, the Rural Electrification Agency was developed. And in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, brought electricity to rural areas across America, including California. On the broadband side, it's the same thing, because if you develop those apps, and that discussion came up yesterday, the connectivity aspect, if you have the app, if you have the light bulb, it doesn't do you any good if you don't have electricity or you don't have the rural broadband, and that's the connection in there. So I'd like to conclude with these remarks. The ag sector, to repeat, the ag sector is rapidly adopting chip-based ag technology, which offers substantial increases in efficiencies in irrigation and other inputs such as ag chemicals. Farm workers are affected not only by fallow land, but shifts in the type of agriculture and the technological skills needed. The ag sector and farm workers need access to better broadband to utilize the new and evolving ag technology, to acquire the new ag tech skills needed for farming available via distance learning and rural community colleges. The rural broadband infrastructure is the critical underlying platform for adaptation to disruption caused by drought and for the future economy of rural areas. So I'll leave you with my vision statement. Development of new agriculture technology and its adoption in California offers continued growth of the agriculture economy and the potential to develop agriculture technology clusters across California, with the caveat, if there is robust broadband infrastructure in rural areas. So thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Tim Johnson, President and CEO for the California Rice Commission. Please.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today. I am Tim Johnson of the California Rice Commission. We represent the state's rice farmers as well as the rice marketers. There are over 40. We're about $1 billion a year industry, and we grow rice on average about 550,000 acres. Really, we'll have my comments focus on 3 areas, very practical, as you would expect from a farmer, an agricultural group. First will be the impact of the drought on our industry. I think it's quite remarkable and fairly unique. I will also talk about actions that I do not believe will help from this body moving forward. I'll conclude on some actions that we do believe would make the drought situation better for the coming years. Well, first, with regard to the impact of the drought on our industry, really no single crop has been more impacted, maybe forage crops, than rice. Last year, in 2014, we grew 25% less acres. This year, for 2015, it got even worse, 30% fewer acres planted. So this year, we'll grow 411,000 acres of rice. That's a reduction of 139,000 acres. You hear this number, 500,000 acres of fallowed ground in addition. That 139,000 of that was rice. It's meant significant impact on farmers and communities and suppliers, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on the supplier side in my comments. Of course, less income, fewer farm jobs. Farm jobs in rice tend to be long-term employees, sometimes multi-generational. Farmers doing everything they possibly can to keep as many people employed, maybe fewer seasonal workers, but we're also starting to see that erode into your long-term 20, 30-year employees with benefits, members of the family, and it's having an impact. Also less tax revenue and less need for services. Yesterday I happened to be standing at Farm Air, which is an ag applicator just right outside Sacramento, and I asked Bill Porter, I said, Bill, how have you been dealing with the drought? Fewer acres of rice, fewer need for planes to plant my rice seed, fewer needs for applications of crop protection materials and fertilizer. And it struck me that he said, well, my solution this year has been to sell one of my planes. So you're selling your means for your economic livelihood because that's the only option that you have left. He said, if it rains, maybe next year I'll hire that pilot back and I'll lease a plane. He says, if it rains for 2 years, maybe I'll buy that plane back. But those are the kinds of real-world decisions that farmers are making. You're selling equipment. You're selling ground. And our suppliers are having to do the same thing. So while it's been very flexible, I agree with the comments made by the economist Dr. Lund earlier, we've had amazing resiliency, but it has come at significant and real cost. The other thing I'd like to talk about, which is a little less recognized, certainly been alluded to today by a number of speakers, is there's also a less recognized impact, and that's on wildlife. Fully 60% of the food for the Pacific Flyway in the entire Central Valley, so we're talking about Bakersfield to Redding, 60% of the food for the 7 to 10 million ducks, geese, and shorebirds that are here now and will be here through March comes from rice fields. And so this last winter, not only did we have, less acres planted, we normally flood about 300,000 acres to decompose rice straw. All right, we had to have Herculean efforts by our water managers, farmers, environmental and conservation groups we work with, and the state to be able to flood 100,000 acres. 2/3 then of the habitat that rice fields provide that are so critical are just not available unless it starts raining immediately. I also think that the other less recognized impacts are on the operational changes and investments for fish that have been made by many farmers. We talk a lot about farmers versus fish, and certainly in the Sacramento Valley, our ability to grow a crop and invest in our infrastructure also benefits salmon. For example, this year in the Sacramento Valley, the Reclamation District 108 funded all the permitting processes that really jump-started a project called the Knights Landing Outfall Gates. They paid for the permitting so the federal government could come in and invest in the infrastructure, and that will keep then salmon out of the Colusa Basin drain and allow them to stay in the river and be more successful. Glen Colusa Irrigation District put gravel beds in the Sacramento River, also just like Reclamation District, outside their service area. So those types of investments are less available when your farming economy suffers. Now, there's been a lot of angst, obviously, about the drought. I think many of us in the agricultural community feel like there's some simmering action by the legislature, and I'd like, if I might, politely but clearly focus on a few things we'd like not to see from the legislature. I don't believe, and none of my colleagues that I speak to believe, that a change in the water rights system would be at all helpful at this juncture. The system works. It's tested. It's foundational. It provides certainty. For us in the Sacramento Valley, it's allowed those of us with senior water rights to have that certainty to be able to transfer water to others. You take away that certainty, and that system in the Sacramento Valley will be thrown into turmoil. It's also allowed us to plant rice, provide the environmental benefits that we have talked about, but also has allowed us to work with our local cities and our rural communities to really operate that system as a whole. If you change that foundation, all of that will change. The second thing I think that would not be helpful is more legislation on groundwater. Agencies and farmers are working hard to implement legislation that was passed last year. That's significant. 2022, the Sacramento Valley will have, as required, the programs in place. Folks are working very hard, very difficult, very broad piece of legislation that was passed. And I just don't think, from anybody that I talk to, that additional legislation on groundwater would be even able to be accommodated into the operating reality that we face. What then should we do? We really do need the $2.7 billion in public benefits for storage that were passed in Proposition 1. In the north, as many have said, and this is, you'll hear it regionally from everybody, but in the Sacramento Valley, it's really the Sites Reservoir. As Assemblymember Gallagher had pointed to, if Sites Reservoir were in place just this last year, right, 4th year of a drought, 400,000 acre-feet of water would have been available for the system, right, for environmental uses, for cities, right, for farming. That's 100,000 acres of crops, right, that could have been planted. It also means for our urban neighbors significant benefit to their water systems. Folsom Reservoir was called on significantly for environmental flows this year, right? That water would have been available in Sites Reservoir. Again, local project, regional project, takes those storm flows, right, puts them into a reservoir that we call an off-stream reservoir. The last item I'd just like to close with is added flexibility for our water managers to do what they do best, which is to manage water for multiple benefits. I don't know a single water manager that talks about managing water for the rice industry. They talk about managing water for agriculture in their district. They're adjoining communities, Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge, not even one of their their members, their clients. They talk about putting in projects that benefit the Sacramento River. And I think the foundational element for the flexibility this year has not only been the farmers, but the ability to manage that system dynamically, be able to change when you take deliveries out of the rivers, et cetera, to be able to provide environmental benefit, and agricultural benefit, as well as to allow some winter flooding as well. Everything that we can do to make those systems more flexible, allow the professional engineers, to sit down and figure out how to get the most out of this system, those are the kinds of things I think that would benefit us moving forward. Thank you very much.